Good evening, and welcome to Talking Volumes. I'm Stephanie Curtis, Director of Programming for NPR News. From COVID 19 to climate change to the economic downturn to injustices in our policing and legal system, the most pressing issues we face in America are disproportionately affecting people of color. So, for this series, we're bringing together a diverse group of authors to talk about their books, which all provide unique insights on America's racial divide. We have poets Reginald Dwayne Betts and M. Scott Momaday, and novelists Chang-rae Lee and Naima Coster. You can get more information on this series, links to local booksellers, and tickets to all Talking Volumes events at mprevents.org. Tonight, we will have a 60-minute in-depth interview with the author, followed by a panel discussion presented by our partners at Star Tribune. If you haven't had a chance, check out the author profile at startribune.com. You can also listen to the radio broadcast of this interview on NPR News Friday at 9 a.m. We'd like to thank our generous sponsors, Thomson Reuters, for their support. Now, please welcome your host for this evening, NPR News reporter Brandt Williams.
I'm Brandt Williams, and welcome to Talking Volumes. I'm very happy to welcome my guest today, award-winning and New York Times bestselling author Chang-rae Lee. His past works have incorporated issues of race, class, and immigration in the United States, and his latest novel, My Year Abroad, follows Tiller Bardman. He's a 20-year-old suburbanite who is at best slightly tethered to his own Asian American identity. In fact, he describes himself as a semi-diasporic, post-colonial indeterminate. And we're going to talk about that more. And besides being an author, Chang-rae also teaches writing at Stanford University. Chang-rae Lee, welcome to Talking Volumes.
Thanks for having me, Brent.
You bet. You know, I really enjoyed the book. I have to say it took me places where I've never been, and in more ways than one. But before we dive into the novel, let's talk a little bit about like the biggest story in the world right now, which is, of course, the pandemic. So I want to start by asking you, how are you doing? How are you managing in the pandemic right now?
Well, it's as with most people, we've had our ups and downs.
Yeah.
I'm actually on leave this year from teaching at Stanford, and I had plans to be on sabbatical. So I am on sabbatical, but usually sabbatical entails doing research, traveling,
Right.
gearing up for the next book, and finding myself some quiet place and hunkering down and sitting at my desk and working. So that hasn't happened.
Yeah, I bet.
I've
Were you writing the novel during the pandemic? Were you writing?
No, I was doing the last bits of editing when the
Okay.
pandemic started, and so it's a pre-pandemic novel. Although a lot of people have been asking me, saying, "Well, I can't believe you wrote this before the pandemic because it's sort of a pandemic novel,
Right.
in that it takes people on these wild journeys and also has a part of the book that's about being kind of hiding and cloistered
Right.
in
Right.
witness protection, which I think we all feel like we are.
That's true. That's very appropriate for now. And I also felt that as I was reading, that was one of the things I enjoyed the most about it was that sense of getting a chance to travel again. That's one of the things I missed the most about the pandemic and not traveling and going to restaurants and having great
Yeah.
food experiences. And that's all contained in the
Yes.
book.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly. I think that's the. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask you also about, because the pandemic has also exposed a lot of the fissures in America right now, of course. The divide between rich and poor, black and white, folks of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And it's also, I'm sure you're aware, you've seen this rise in anti-Asian rhetoric and violence as well.
Mm-hmm.
Give me your sense of where that comes from.
Well, that rhetoric, of course, has been with us, throughout American history,
Right.
dating back from the first settlers in Hawaii and then in the West Coast and everywhere else. But of course, that was, you know, Donald Trump put an accelerant on all that. And, with his Kung flu business, the China virus, really just inviting, as we know, bad actors and malign people to act out and have sanction, because
Right.
from the commander in chief. So it's no surprise to me, and I think all of my Asian American friends and colleagues were anticipating this, that it
Mm.
would result in violence, people actually getting hurt and killed.
Right.
And we've seen that just recently, particularly here in the Bay Area where I am, these horrible videos of elderly Asian people being knocked over and violently, assaulted, defenseless people.
Right.
And I can't believe this is just happening as a coincidence
Sure.
of of history. I mean, this is a direct, this has been birthed directly from the political environment, which of course seeps into our social and cultural environment. Uh, and
Right.
and and this is when when I grew up. I grew up in New York in the 1970s, and not many not many Korean immigrants around.
Hmm.
And like anybody else, minority kid, the subject of taunts and all that kind of stuff. And
Right.
I always say, hey, it wasn't like other people, who had to endure actual lots of physical violence and threats and assaults. But and I always went by the thing, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. The
Right.
problem, of course, which is true on the micro level, but it's not true on the macro level, that
Right.
language, um, certain notions about how people belong, about the value of people, about their humanity. And when those things are denigrated, people who, for whatever reason, act out.
Right.
And so it's been particularly depressing and enraging to me to see these
Right.
videos.
It reminded me after the post 9/11 when there were people who are Sikhs who are targeted for anti-Muslim hatred
Mm,
when Sikhs are not Muslims, and it just seems
exactly.
like there's an indiscriminate amount of backlash against anyone who, uh, after COVID, in the midst of COVID, who appears Asian even,
Yes,
and I think that was also part of some of the backlash that you saw was people who may not even be Asian who are targeted.
exactly. And again, it's these people are not, obviously, these are stranger encounters. So what it really means is that people are, for whatever reason that they have, whether they're, mentally not right,
Mm.
frustrated, looking to do mayhem, they have a scapegoat that's been served up to them, by some of our most powerful people.
Right. Right.
So that's obviously the people who are committing these crimes need to be held accountable. But I hold also most accountable, the rhetoric that comes from Trump and other people.
Right. I want to get to about the book, and I was looking at you gave a talk at the 2010 National Book Festival after you released The Surrendered, and you said this quote, writers often write to fill in their questions, to satisfy some curiosity about a particular subject. So I want to know, was there a particular subject that you had in mind that you were particularly curious about when you were writing My Year Abroad?
Yeah, I think it was a question about, and maybe this gets back to your original question about the pandemic and how I've been experiencing it in my life. Like, what is the nature of vitality? Well, I
Mm.
mean, what is the nature of occupying this space in this moment? I guess it's a philosophical question, but it's also I think, a corporal question, a visceral question, and I was interested in how those two things aligned and interrogated one another. Um, this idea that, and maybe it's partly because I'm getting on in age. I'm middle age, 55 years old, and
Okay.
as often people do, we settled in my life, settled in my career. and which of course leads to questions of, okay, what's next? How do I begin again? In thinking about these next whatever years I have left.
Right.
And it makes you really think about, uh, and this is what I was curious about. Why do we go on each day? And that's and I realize that's a pandemic question too, because
Sure.
each day, of course, is kind of Groundhog Day. It's the same monotony of Zooming and going to the grocery store.
Right.
So within that sameness, within that structure of repetition, um, I was looking for, well, what is the true savor? What is the spark that keeps us going? And so that's what I I think set out to answer in the book. It's curious to me that I ended up trying to answer that question through this 20-year-old narrator instead of
Yeah.
a 55-year-old fellow.
That's very interesting, and that's a part of I want to move our discussion to here in a few minutes. But first, let's start with about Tiller, about our main character, our narrator. And I want to go back to that phrase that I started with that you wrote as Tiller kind of describes himself as this semi-diasporic, post-colonial, indeterminate like me, is how he says it. Unpack that a little bit. What are you saying with those words?
Well, he's someone who is, as he lets us know, he's 1/8 ethnically Asian,
Mm-hmm.
racially Asian, and so that, and I purposely and intentionally made him only 1/8 so that he would have experienced and known himself as someone who was essentially passing, um, essentially not noticed in his community most of the time, but with enough of a different kind of lineage and heritage that he would have some consciousness about it. Maybe at this point in his life, a burgeoning curiosity, rather than someone, say, much older who had been thinking about these questions, for many, many decades. He's right at the cusp of, as I saw it, um, of understanding his place in the world as he is perceived, and that's where all that indeterminate post-colonial business is that, yeah, he's kind of tongue in cheek, having fun with certain critical terms about race
Mm-hmm.
and ethnicity and place, but he's also quite serious, I think, in saying, hey, that is also me,
Right.
that these I am subject to um, the wheel of history, to academia, to pop cultural forces. So I think he's just now understanding that he's just not as no one is. He's not just quote unquote a person.
Yeah.
As people, and particularly raced people who are on the margins, people who are on the outside looking in, um, the culture, the context, those forces play a much, much larger role in both how their lives play out and most importantly, how they think of themselves.
And he's growing up in this suburb, this New Jersey suburb, Dunbar. It's got this kind of whitening effect on the
Hmm.
surroundings. And give me a sense of how that type of environment shapes his self identity and in the way he sees others.
Yeah, well, there's a moment in the book that he describes, actually an Asian friend of his experiencing, where the Asian friend, growing up in this very, this privileged white place called Dunbar, he goes skiing, to some fancy place, and I think, as we all know, if you go to the ski slopes, it's really like 95% white, or maybe 98% white, and then there's a smattering of Asians, some black people, some foreigners from somewhere else, you can't tell. But really, as he says in the book, it's a white, 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 white world out there. And so what happens in this experience for his friend is he's all masked up and goggled, and with a helmet. And so he goes up in this chairlift with this nice old couple,
Right.
and they start talking, and the man makes a joke about makes an Asian slur,
Right.
basically, because he said that he was wanting to go to MIT, and assuming that this kid was white as well.
Exactly.
And Tiller takes that and says, yeah, I've also been ski goggled and masked all my life,
Yeah.
and felt comfortable in it until the point at which it's not so comfortable.
Right. Yeah.
Going along with it. And I think that's one of the kind of contradictory modes that some of us live, particularly mixed race kids, Asians in this country who, in many contexts, are honorary whites,
Hmm.
um, where we can go into a place and say, "Hey, I'm just like you.
Right.
I went to Ivy League schools, or I live in this kind of neighborhood, and I'm not that other person."
Right.
Right?
He can
And
almost
there's
pass.
you can almost pass. Of
Pass.
course,
Hmm.
I think what we've seen in the last 4 years is that there is actually a limit to passing. You
Yeah.
can be targeted in the street, whereas, of course, an immigrant of a different generation, of a different era, could end up passing just from the color of their skin.
Right.
So it's that toggle between, feeling as if I'm misunderstood, on the outside, and then also, I can pass well enough that I don't want to deal with the issues of being misunderstood.
Right.
And I think Tiller's at the point where he's I don't know that he has so many fixed ideas about where he wants to be. He's just that I think he's starting again. I think he's trying to think of himself as, yeah, this is I want to now place myself in this world, and that world increasingly is peopled by Asian people and Asian culture,
Right.
which appeals to him.
Yeah. Tell me a bit more about your growing up. You said you grew up in New York and not around a lot of other Asian people your age. Anything about Tiller that reminds you of you at that time, kind of negotiating the world? What things do you have in common with Tiller, and which things are very different?
Yeah, I grew up in at that time, a more solidly middle class, even working class suburb of New York City. Now it's fancier, but uh, and it was predominantly Irish and Italian,
Hmm.
pretty much kind of working class, middle class folks, very Catholic town. And we were one of, I would say, two or three Asian families in the entire town. Maybe there were two black families in town.
Right.
I don't recall there being Latino families in town. So it wasn't unlike some of my friends who grew up in Queens, where there was an ethnic enclave.
Yeah.
I did absolutely feel as if, everywhere I went, I was noticed.
Sure.
Now, luckily, the folks of the town they were for the most part, super welcoming, and I made lots of friends, and so I think, like Tiller, I felt as if I could have the demonstrable evidence that I did belong in certain ways,
Right.
that it was fine, that we were enjoying American life in the ways that you would think that an American immigrant family would want to enjoy American life. And it was true. I did have friends, and it was great. The truth, though, of course, the other truth, though, was when I was out of the context of, say, in the circle of my friends, or at school where everyone knew me, say we played a basketball game somewhere else.
Sure.
Then, of course,
Hmm.
then it was, wow, these people don't see me as Chang, the buddy who's did it. They just see me as that quote unquote Chinese kid. They don't even know
Right.
I'm Korean.
Right. Right.
And they would, say nasty things, or sly snide comments, and that would shake me, personally, of course, because that's always hurtful.
Yeah.
But I think, more to the point, it made me conscious of, huh, everything that who I am is provisional, isn't it? It's provisional in the
Hmm.
sense of where I am, the context I'm in,
Sure.
who's around me, and and that's something that absolutely is something that Tiller's, beginning to see, and that I, for as a writer, have, um, you know, really really investigated, I think, throughout all my work.
So, as you were talking about your experience growing up in New York and facing taunts or insults or slurs based on your ethnicity, uh, it reminds me of Tiller kind of joining this cast, this Pan-Asian cast of characters who represent all different parts of the diaspora, and you hear these different terms and names thrown around, farang, hapa, banana. Give me a sense of how common it is to hear those types of delineations made throughout the diaspora.
Yeah, I think it's, groups. It depends on, with whom you're speaking and with whom you're interacting, right? I mean, with I would say that, when I'm hanging out with my Asian friends, Korean or whatnot, there's a lot more, kind of happy joking
Mhm.
about the ways in which, and I'm sure, every group does this, how someone's this kind of Asian or not so Asian or super Asian, or, you know. And of course, we're all trading in awful stereotypes, but so it's both a way to have fun with them, but also it's a kind of way to deal and negotiate those things, to
Right.
kind of deal with our anxiety about those things as well. And I think it's so much, context based, because, for example, when say I'm in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is essentially an Asian American city, right?
Right.
I mean, there's a different sense of race and difference there, because everyone is so different, because everyone is such a mix of everything.
Sure.
Um, with an Asian, predominance. There's I would say that there's less, sense of any kind of tension or anxiety or strife. Maybe there's less joking. I don't know,
Right.
because it's like you're, as I always say, the water temperature is the same as your body temperature.
Yeah.
There's no gradient. And I think a lot of these kinds of terms come out with us because the gradient is there, and we're trying to fill it somehow. We're trying to assuage it somehow. We're trying to make it feel like, oh, everything's cool, you know. but uh, and again, everything mostly is cool,
Sure.
but still there's a little dissonance, right? And I think that's just a recognition of that.
Is there still? I mean, I've heard obviously there are histories uh, of bad blood between countries like Japan and China, Japan and Korea. Are there still these old? I mean, is there based on these old atrocities that which occurred, in wartime, in conflict?
Well, I wouldn't in those countries, yes. I mean, you go to Korea, and of course it's generational. The older folks in Korea will never think of Japan in the same ways that tweens think of Japan.
Right.
They think of Japan as a pop cultural wonderland, and vice versa. But I don't know that that translates here in the States between ethnic groups.
Sure.
I think there's definitely much more solidarity and common cause, common experience. Not
Mm.
exactly the experience, but I think we feel like we have each other's backs here,
Yeah.
because we have to. We absolutely have to, and as we would in the family of man. You know.
Sure. And I do. There was a passage in the book where Tiller meets a young woman who is a Filipino background, and she's a little darker, and she
Yeah.
is not as popular. And I'm just wondering, I think that was interesting to touch on. I mean, being from a culture as an African American, we still even make fun of ourselves for being darker than
Yes.
others, and so I'm just
Yeah.
wondering how common you see that type of uh, color-based discrimination in the
Well, you
diaspora.
do, absolutely,
Yeah.
and again, it's from everything from the joking, hey, you tan really easily, and
Mm.
you look like a farm worker out there, and it blends into like a classist kind of taunting,
Sure.
and then of course just in the culture in the in the media and the culture, you see in K dramas and J dramas and all Asian dramas. I mean, boy, aren't these people so lily pearly white? You
Yeah.
know, you
Yeah.
rarely see, and of course when I go over to Korea, if I've been out in the summertime and I'm tan, people say, "Wow, you don't mind being tan." So
That
there
is
is definitely
interesting
this,
now.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's absolutely a color sensitivity,
Right.
and even and again, it's one of those markers that's completely superficial, and yet great swaths of the public take it very seriously.
Yeah, and you pay close attention to a lot of characteristics about the about your characters, and how they speak, in the way they speak English and what type of accent they may have, and Pong Lu being one of those. Give me a sense of why you felt it was important to highlight that in as a part of their, for lack of a better term, character. Why
Yes, yes.
paying attention to how they speak English?
Well, it's more about Tiller paying attention to it,
Right.
and him trying to figure out, well, who are these people? What are the nature of their origins? What are all the threads running through them? And he's very attuned to all the different kinds of English that are spoken. From Pong Lu's Mandarin inflected English to another guy's. He's got some Afro-Caribbean stuff going on with
Hmm.
it's it, and he's or Japanese, and so he's a he's someone who's very sensitive to that, and maybe that comes from me too. Just being a kid who grew up not speaking English. When we first got here, uh, you know, you're in the position of just listening as carefully as you can. And
Right.
what ends up happening is that you're attentive to all the little differences
Hmm.
in the ways that people express themselves and and play around and negotiate the language. Uh, so I grew up in, when we first got sort of settled and I was old enough, we lived in a really diverse neighborhood where there are all races, all kinds of English, all stage English, you know,
Yeah. Right.
and that to me was something that I think is very formative for me
Right.
in terms of how I thought about myself and I thought about my community.
Right. Obviously, immigration is plays a big role in this novel as well. And I want to ask you some more about, especially when it comes to the character of Pong Lu. He's this Chinese immigrant entrepreneur. I don't want to go too deeply into his past, but there are some twists and turns there that I nearly broke out into applause. I was reading. I was like, well played, sir. But obviously, his immigrant story is pretty central to this, to the novel. And so I'd like you to read from one of the first passages that we set aside. I set aside, and it really has to do with this taking place, kind of a visit to Pong Lu's house, and what we see, what Tiller sees there, and what he observes. And so, before you read, why don't you set up for folks a little background there on what you're going to read and what the scene is here.
Yeah, so Tiller, the 20-year-old kid who's living in this town called Dunbar, in an earlier chapter, he meets this fellow named Pong Lu, a Chinese entrepreneur. He's got lots of businesses, um, and he gets to see the businesses. But this is the first time that um, he gets to go to Pong's house, and Pong invites him over and shows him what's going on there. And it turns out there are people working there. He fist bumped me to say everything was okay and proceeded to show me around the various stadium levels of his custom-built home. It was designed, I would learn, by a team of architecture and interior design grad students in Shanghai, using Pong's rough drawings and photographs of the lot. They drew it up and furnished it exactly the way he wanted from cabinet and furniture makers in China, and at a fraction of the typical fee, although even now there was sledgehammering coming from below decks. There was some renovation work going on in the basement. The girls were getting older and wanted a more sophisticated look to their hideout/lair, upgrading from a tweeny romper room to something more like a first-class airline lounge, at least as I saw from the magazine photos and fabric swatches plastered on the ideas board they'd made up for their father. Pong wanted to check on progress, and when we got down there, the crew saluted us gruffly but enthusiastically. They were, I would learn, all from Fujian province, undocumented and of course unlicensed, and drove out nightly from New York City. One pair was doing the demolition, and the other loading 5-gallon buckets filled with shards of shower tiles, chalky wall-board, and nail-encrusted studs, and ferrying them out of the walkout basement to their cube van parked near the back corner of the house, where they would hoffa the detritus nobody would ever know. I noticed one bucket for their food containers and soda cans and another for cigarette butts and piss, and they knew not to come up to the house proper. They worked here nights because they worked days back in the city. Plus, this way, Pong could employ them without a local construction permit and skirt the tax bump from the property reassessment that would inevitably result. Plus, it was better for avoiding ice. Win, win, win. They'd done a number of similar moonlight jobs in Dunbar, and on some genuinely historic houses, Pong setting them up with friends seeking decent work done off the books, at two-thirds the cost and in half the time. Renovating attics and basements is their sweet spot, Pong said, he and Bai, the husky foreman, showing me the emptied space of what would be a new basement powder room. Perhaps redoing a study or baby room, but you would not want them for anything that requires high-end finishes and detailing, like kitchen cabinets or the master bath. They know their capabilities. Bai grinned at us with his grizzled 9 p.m. shadow, obviously understanding the gist of what Pong was saying and not caring one bit. Pong went on, because of the good price, my American friends who hire them want to renovate the rest of the house, but I have to tell them, no, you better stop. People are successful when they stick with what they do best. One friend did not listen, and he contracted with them on his own to install a steam shower with very expensive English fixtures and handmade Italian tile. His wife and her designer said the work was subpar, and after a couple of rounds of poor fixes, he had to hire a full-price crew to redo the whole thing. He spent more than double what he would have, and for 6 months he had to shower downstairs. He is still angry at me, but I am not angry at him. However, he is not a friend anymore. Before we went back up, Pong peeled bills off the thick money roll from his pocket and gave them to Bai, $100 each, plus an extra franklin for the foreman, who heartily made a play of refusing the dough with bows and bluster before palming the bills into the back of his dusty jeans. They were doing the project at cost, in appreciation for the numerous jobs Pong set up for them, an essentially general contractor. They spoke minimal English, and Pong explained that he sometimes had to slip away from Bader Garth and pop in on a project to translate and/or smooth over some misunderstanding. He didn't take any cut. He was just being helpful and useful to his circle in his comprehensive and effortless Pong way, the circle being larger than I imagined even here in crusty old Dunbar, where labradoodles outnumber the ethnics and mayonnaise is still the number one sauce. Back up on the ground floor, in a low-lit home gym, piped in with a chill EDM playlist, the coolish air zapped clean by a tower ionizer that was also misting a floral tropical scent, Pong's wife, Minori, was being tutored in a yoga pose by not one but two instructors, a woman and a man. The woman was demonstrating the position while the man adjusted Minori's cut arms and legs. Her instructors were semi-translucent black body types and were possessed of the most perfect physiques I'd ever seen, at least that close up, a bristling display of delts and lats and glutes. This is Tiller, Pong said to her. He was a big help today at the yogurt shop. Nice to meet you, Minori crooned, her Japanese accent as stout as Pong's Mandarin brogue. She was a cat-eyed fireplug of a beauty, and so fit and youthful-looking in her silvery spandex that I wouldn't have blinked if she had leapt right into a J-pop number. Will you work for my husband on his new drink venture? I glanced at Pong, who, while typing away at his phone, shotgunned her mid-tap but didn't specify what the venture was. Minori and her instructors shifted to a lunge position, but I kept quiet, not wanting to presume anything despite the dawning idea that it would be utterly cool to be counted as one of Pong's associates or friends, even if that meant being a chronically indigested taster. Careful, she said to me coyly, one hand raised high while the other tagged the back of her knee. You will have too many stories to tell if you do. Everyone who comes to know Pong Lu cannot stop talking about him. Without peering up from his keystroking, Pong said, My wife oversells and mocks me at the same time. Someone must, she said to me, smoothly transitioning to the mirror image position. Otherwise, he will fly off and never come back. Someone needs to fly to keep all of this floating. The instructors blankly stared into space like Bernini statues, trying to stay inconspicuous. Someone likes the floating as much as we do. Pong finished up his messaging, admitting to me, Yes, I do appreciate nice things. He pronounced appreciate with a most satisfying, if slightly tortured warble. I enjoy it more when I can share, but if all disappeared tomorrow, I would be fine, as long as I had my girls. I wonder if his wife is one of his girls, Minori said. First and last, Pong said, moving alongside her.
Thanks for reading that. So I chose that because I think it offers an interesting window into Pong's life and how he has these workers in his home who are doing this off the books work, and give me a sense of how the importance of having Pong Lu be this character who's helping to foster perhaps the American stories, the American dreams of folks who years ago were like him as he came and was working to make it here in the United States. Why was that important to include that part of that?
Well, it's certainly one of the appeals of Pong Lu as Tiller comes to recognize it and appreciate it. He's not some kind of billionaire oligarch with, massive Fortune 500 business. He's a small time guy, but with, his fingers in lots of different things, on the ground, working with people, this is just one example of all the kinds of little mercantile projects that he's got going. And I wanted to show that it would have been easier in some ways to have him just some kind of world crushing billionaire, but that's no fun, right? I mean,
Right.
and that's not the truth of the experience that Pong has himself and that Tiller finds so appealing and charismatic. The sense that you have these people like the Foreman Bai, who just by their own pluck and by their own energy, by their own fearlessness, are just putting themselves into position to extract as much as they can in the small way they can
Right.
from the economy and from the culture.
Yeah,
And
it's
that
almost
to
like
me,
Pong. I'm sorry. I was going to say it feels like Pong really respects the game. He respects the hustle, and he
he
sees it, and
does.
yeah.
And that's the thing that I think Tiller recognizes in Pong. It's not that he's so interested in money. Yeah, but the money is good, but he loves, as you say, the game. He loves um, the getting out there and the wrestling with the environs and whatever opportunities you can extract from it or find. That kind of energy is what Tiller, I think, has. Um, well, he's young, so he hasn't lost it, but he's never quite uh, nurtured that kind of energy in himself. He's as the book starts, he's kind of indolent, you know, kind of in a weird state of stasis, and he's looking for some spark, and I think this is the kind of strive or spark that at least begins their journey.
Right. Give me some sense of again, Pong Lu is this such a bigger than life in many ways kind of type of character who also tries to not necessarily fly below the radar, but it seems like he's not the big flamboyant guy who's going to go out there and throw money around everywhere he goes. Give
Mm.
me a sense of when you were writing him, what type of people did you have in mind? Were there people in your life that you saw that kind of had his energy, his backstory?
Yes, he was inspired. The character Pong Lu was inspired by a friend and acquaintance of mine when I lived in Princeton, and then some other fellows that I met there. And they appealed to me because they were a different kind of immigrant, in my view. An immigrant who, not your typical kind of coming up here with nothing in their pocket, but also kind of, scared and cowed by the culture without any power. He's someone who comes over with a sense that no, everything's within my grasp. Maybe it's the information age, maybe it's our globalized world, but an immigrant who's immediately, even if he doesn't have anything in his pocket, immediately feels like he can stride in the ways of any of the locals. And that kind of fearlessness and that kind of pluck, I just found really charming,
Right.
and inspiring. I guess I'd always felt like I was that immigrant, but I realized no, I'm not that immigrant anymore. I'm a maybe too settled, too comfortable fellow who maybe forgot about his origins, and that's why I include in the book Pong's origins.
Mm-hmm.
In Cultural Revolution era China, and his family story there, not just for backstory to understand his legacy, but to show people, and I think this is every immigrant story. Immigrants carry with them so many episodes, so many experiences that we'll never hear about,
Right.
that you can't appreciate. Um, all the things that they'd seen, witnessed, and endured.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I would always want to write when I write my characters is you can't just see that person here.
Sure.
It's not the whole picture. You have to have the other picture to make any sense of it.
As you mentioned, Peng Lu's father, who is living with him in his family as well. Um, I'm interested in the family relations, how you write about them, how you write them. Tiller and his father are loving but distant. Peng Lu's father is there, but he's certainly not the same man that he was back in China, as they were driven from during the cultural revolution. But I'm most struck by the characters, the mothers of characters. And Tiller is his mom is no longer around. Give me a sense of the significance of having, because it's common to see like the distant father figure in popular culture, but people losing their mothers, especially in the ways that Peng Lu lost his mother, and the way that Tiller's mom left the picture. Give me a sense of why you felt that was central to have those types of relationships between these characters and their mothers.
Yeah, I wanted to have them to have that in common. A sense that, as you mentioned, the fathers are still around, but I think both men feel a bit orphaned. And Tiller, in fact, really calls himself a kind of orphan. And even though he does love his father, the relationship is, not just, it's just kind of convenient and comfortable, but it doesn't do anything below the surface. And I think this is what is, missing, and it's a huge question in his life. I think for both Tiller and Pong, which is, how do you go on when you've lost uh, that maternal, presence?
Right.
For me, I think it's a huge void in someone's life.
Yeah.
And there are differences between mothers and fathers, right?
Sure.
I mean,
Right.
and that's a void that I think is both known and absolutely mysterious in the ways in which it can affect somebody.
Right.
And so it was so much of what Tiller doesn't talk about his mother much in the book.
Mm.
It kind of, we glance upon it, it's an obliquely noted, um, but I wanted to get the sense that it was always there, it is there, and it always will be there in
Right.
whatever he does. And that's the kind of background hum of the echo of the void that is the is backing up all the stuff and action in the foreground.
Mhm.
It is this kind of wistful echo in the background that he's trying to make sense of.
Yeah, and it definitely seems to have had an impact on his current relationships with women, the way he relates to women,
Hmm.
the way he sees them, and with
Yes.
his current girlfriend, who is older, an older woman. Give me a sense of. I mean, the other through line that I saw was obviously his Tiller's mother appeared to have been afflicted with some type of mental illness. Tiller's girlfriend struggles with mental illness. Give me a sense of why you incorporated that into the story.
I felt as if Tiller would, and this is everything that for me in terms of writing characters. As a writer, you always want to um, have the character confront the very things that are most thorny, most troublesome, most mysterious, right? The things that really are almost unspeakable and that he can't really handle.
Right.
And that when you do that, that's when people really show themselves. That's when people begin to really speak and act in a way that is true. And and so I wanted him to have to deal with this young this woman that he's dating, and to have it fine, except that there was this undercurrent of real desperation there.
Yeah.
That's something that he would have to deal with in the present time in a mature way, that he would have to take a stand. And I think that's what, and maybe this is the way that he's responding to, say, the disappearance or void of not having a mother through his childhood. It's like, what is he going to do now?
Right.
Will he run away? Which is something he's kind of been doing, although running away inside of himself in his self-styled mediocrity. And I think now I wanted to force him to try to face up to a moment where he had to either stand and deliver or completely fail. And that to me was really the driving force behind who Val is. Obviously, also, they have a great love for each other, and I wanted Tiller to be able to experience and think about that love.
Right. And give me a sense of in writing female characters, writing Asian female characters. Obviously, I have to imagine you're very aware of the stereotypes and tropes of how Asian American women have been portrayed in popular culture. What were some things that you wanted to make sure that you wanted to stay clear of? What's the challenge there?
Well, the challenge, of course, is that and we know those tropes, right? The meek, servile, ever obliging, exotic, exotically beautiful Asian woman, right? Uh,
Mm.
the yellow fever woman, right? Who is the fantasy of Western man, uh, to be delighted and plundered, and and one of the things that I wanted to turn, because Tiller is also a Western man, he
Mm.
is, as we talked about earlier, he's all these things. He's Asian, but he's also Western, and I wanted him to encounter these women who are in certain situations, in, say, typical kind of sex worker or kind of attendant roles, but to have their roles kind of upturned, and that Tiller would end up being the object of inquiry and affection rather than the author of it. And that's one of the ways that I hoped that I could upturn these encounters, where Tiller literally gets put through the ringer in several different ways, not just with women, but also in with other Asian types.
Right.
Say an Asian chef who's another typical kind of comedic role that you'll see in the mainstream media, right?
Right.
But I did want Tiller to have to experience what it feels like uh, to be the one who's scrutinized, to be the one who's maybe used up a little bit, uh,
Yeah.
and to maybe push him to the idea that, this is these are the kinds of actions that we are all trafficking in, and that sometimes those things can bite you back.
Yeah. And there's a portion of the book where he is seen as something of as an exotic himself, and
Mm.
there is a female character who practically treats him like a science experiment, like
Yes.
observing him like he's this other, and he's been objectified and examined. And was that on purpose on your
That
part?
was absolute. Well, it was also to have a lot of fun, but 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 the critical theorist in me wanted to also um, turn the context around for him, and turn the narrative against him,
Right.
and see and to see how he would react to it. Um, I think for Tiller though, one of the ways in which I found it more hopeful is that it somehow renews him. He doesn't just reject it and say, "Oh, this is an injustice." I think what I wanted him to do is do what we all should do, which is when just to turn it around and think about, these are the issues I've been, say, perpetrated upon. I've been victimized in some way, but I'm going to learn from it, and maybe maybe it leads to some kind of wisdom about what he should do in a future episode.
There's another major theme throughout the book which deals with this idea of exporting culture, Asian, Pan Asian culture to the Western world. And these main characters are part of the exploit is to take this elixir, this juice, based on this traditional formula, and market it. And there's also yoga plays a role in this, and there these other things that are came from the East and has been adopted by people in the West, particularly Americans. And there's another part of the book that I want you to read that gets to as these the group of investors that Pong has collected and young Tiller are starting to get the plan together about what this product is, what it's going to do, what's the promise. And we meet another person in here who is the creator of this, what they're calling an elixir. But before you read that, go ahead and set up this particular. I believe we're in the characters in Hawaii at this point, and
Hmm.
they're kind of going over what's going to happen next. So if you can, please set up what you're gonna read first.
Yeah, so the Tiller is going to be introduced to this fellow named Getty, who is the maker of this custom formula of what they call jamu, which is this Indonesian kind of health tonic that you can get in Indonesia anywhere on the street. But of course, as you say, they're going to repackage that and brand it for Western consumption. And so this is when Tiller gets to taste it and taste the product before I guess they start marketing it. We moved on to the business at hand, sampling the various jamu Getty had blended, obviously more for flavor and texture than for any restorative effects, so the partners could sign off on the final potions that their newly formed LLC would produce and bottle in an industrial park just outside Shenzhen, and then sell all around Asia, first in lower end markets like KL and Bangkok, and eventually they hoped in tonier places such as Shanghai and Tokyo. Looking at the blenders of various puddle-colored juice, it all sounded a bit optimistic to me. But then these guys were confident, prosperous, globe-surfing entrepreneurs, and I was your basic know-nothing, privileged American college kid who, if you really think about all that's desperately wanting in this world, might well be the lowest of the low. In bright future these shall be famous too in the West, Getty proclaimed, pouring out sampler glasses for each of us. What did they taste like? It's difficult to say. This was quite a leap from WTF yo. I guess they tasted okay in that they were, respectively, sweet enough, salty enough, bitter but like a bitter chocolate, with the last one weirdly meaty, as if from a vegetable full of hormones, not juice. But it was how they felt in the mouth that struck me as literally sensational. Think of the chilly burn from an intense breath mint, or the good dull ache in the gums after a dental cleaning, or the tingling vibrato when the girl you're kissing suddenly sucks in the tip of your tongue and the rest of you would instantly fold yourself forever into that glistening space. And maybe then you'd get an idea of what Getty's jamu were. Not just flavors, but this insistent presence in the mouth, like you become the host of a thing with its own undeniable life. Yeah, I know. They were the first jamu I'd ever had, but you had to believe that Getty was a legit jamu master. Very nice, Lucky said, licking his lips. I think these formulations are perfect. If I remember correctly, this last one is meant for sexual vigor, right? Biggest help for that, yes, Getty replied. But you are being too strict. You are a businessman, I know, but when you let our jamu go into America, let it be jamu, not medicine. Please remember, gentlemen, my jamu is not regular jamu. You must know my jamu as the beginning of a good way, not the ending of a problem. Do not believe in the idea of healings. There are no healings because there are no wounds. I think we know what you mean, Lucky assured him. Holistic integrity and all that. But we have to go to market too, right? We can't educate the world in an instant. It'll take one bottle at a time for the people who feel they need to be whole. And what do you think, young blood? Will younger people buy into this? Everybody turned to me, awaiting my answer. What popped up was a picture of Clark at the kitchen table each morning, a mixed herd of meds scattered next to his coffee mug. One pill for his hypertension, another for the rashes he got from the hypertension pills, another for the insomnia from the rash pills, for which he then needed an entire pot of coffee in the morning, and a couple more pots at the office, for which he periodically needed reflux pills, which messed up his appetite, which made him anxious and definitely raised his blood pressure, and so on and so forth, none of which seemed to appear until after my mother checked out one blustery spring day and never checked back in. We could get into Jamu, I said, though maybe if it were marketed as a natural energy drink, it would be more successful. You know, like an all organic Red Bull. Very good idea, Pong said. I like it, Lucky said. A rock star boosted Jamba juice. Pong said, Tiller has a most discriminating palate. He can help formulate a youth targeted cuvee. Definitely. And please, something sweeter. These are all too bitter for anyone under 30, Lucky said. Getty groaned. Please, gentlemen, my Jamo is not to be as American soft drinks. That's enough, Blender Man, Lucky said sharply. Getty sniffed but said nothing. Suddenly, I could see Lucky's family resemblance to his mother, the shared, subtle flare at the corner of the eyes, this almost ancient Egyptian edging that cast a cold and sober gaze. We have a capable new associate at our disposal who also happens to be representative of our potentially largest demographic, younger whites. I know Tiller is not all howly, but he knows what I'm saying. He certainly does, Pong said. He's one of us now. My Sundubu brother, Lucky muttered. But you get my meaning, right, boy? You can lend us a perspective we don't have. I nodded, for I was the most Caucasian person present, Getty having long transformed himself into a race of one. He now regarded me hotly, marking me for some ornate and awful fate. Yet it felt funny to be singled out, even positively. The few times it had happened to me, it was definitely the other way around, by people who knew me and wanted to make a lame joke, like asking me how they should hold their chopsticks, or which Hello Kitty character was my favorite. I wasn't bothered at all. I never had much racial or ethnic pride. But of course, that's my Howley part talking, which doesn't require much girding or encouragement, already having most of life validated. But now I had already forgotten how I appeared to the world. And I liked it. I felt sharper, stronger, my feet now actually tingling with both litheness and rootedness, the diluted part of me, maybe now coming together, concentrating, if not yet bloomed, in a brighter, bolder color.
Thanks for reading that. And of course, there's mention of Clark, who is Tiller's father, which he refers to by his first name. And also, what is the term haole? What does that mean?
That's a term that they use in Hawaii for essentially a white person. Say the tourists from mainland. And it's I suppose a sort of a slur, but it's used, unfairly or not.
Right, right.
It's part of the
So,
current.
so there's a lot there that I was interested in. I think plays a central role in this novel is this, which I think plays into a larger conversation about cultural appropriation and how the West has adopted these Eastern cultural icons and such as yoga and these any traditional juice. If it comes from Indonesia, then it must have this magical property or something.
Right.
Give me a sense of is that how you took it too? Is how these guys were capitalizing on this Western appetite for all things Eastern or Asian?
Oh, surely. I think they recognize that. As we have all seen, we appropriate and expropriate things from all over, but particularly in Asia, from Asia, there's a sense of, well, they have some ancient wisdom and knowledge about the way things really work with the body, and so all these things, as you mentioned, the yoga, the health potion, other kinds of medicines that are, purportedly, more natural and more in alignment with, how human beings should be. And it's a Western idea about these properties that these businessmen, of course, are trying to take advantage of.
Right. We also have this when we talk about cultural appropriation and how, and I'm sure you've seen some of the discussions about whether or not it's appropriate for people who are not a Japanese person having a tattoo of Japanese characters on them or wearing kimonos and that sort of thing. Have you been part of those discussions?
Not really.
Mm-hmm.
I've maybe, I guess I'm a little of an older generation where, that kind of stuff was just kind of, what happened, right? And so I guess my first encounter with cultural appropriation was when I was younger, in the 70s. This is after Bruce Lee died, but because my last name was Lee, I'd always be asked by the kids in my neighborhood, mostly the Black and Latino boys, if I knew Bruce Lee and if I was related to Bruce Lee. But I loved, and just it wasn't to taunt me; it was actually curiosity. But he was such a hero to them, and I loved how they sometimes would dress like him, like on Halloween, and do his moves and speak like him, not to mock him, but just because he was their hero. And that was a moment of cultural appropriation that I really relished and thought was fantastic.
Wow. That wouldn't go
Yeah.
over today.
No, it wouldn't go over today,
Yeah.
but to me, as a kind of a quiet Asian kid, who's, the kids I looked up to in the playground were these boys who had a lot of power and cool.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was amazing, and so it cuts both ways, right? Cultural appropriation is is both. It should be, well, one hopes, a celebration rather than a repackaging, so that you can somehow, that somehow mutates or dysmorphs, that tradition. And
Sure.
but everything, I guess, it's a big discussion, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it surrounds the idea of folks monetizing somebody else's culture.
Yes.
They're taking this and they're
Right.
making
Right.
money off of it.
But but this is our society, right? I mean, this book is so much. There's an interest in this book about capitalism and its and its and its excesses, and Pong and his crew are A1 capitalists, right?
Right.
They know the game, and the game does not. Um, no quarry is out of reach in this game, in this hunt. Whatever culture, whatever they can sell, they'll do it. Because that's the nature of it. That's the nature of getting by. That's the nature of surviving.
Are you a 9 to 5 writer? Are you regimented? Do you get in there and just start writing, or do you wait until the spirit moves you to start working on a novel?
No, I'm a day job writer. I take it. I wake up, have breakfast, get to my desk, write as long as I can, and usually by mid-afternoon I'm pretty fried, and I end of the day do my other things, and just rinse and repeat basically on that score. It's really dull. I don't wait for inspiration. Sometime I'll have an idea at night, but I won't go down and write it. Maybe I'll just note it to myself so that I won't forget it for the next day. But um, I don't. I've never been struck by lightning inspiration kind of writer. Things have to mull. I have to reckon and mull things a long time before I feel comfortable enough to write them down.
Gotcha. Well, I believe that's all the time that we have. Chang-rae Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, and good luck with the novel, and best to you and your family.
Thanks so much, Brand. It was great to talk to you.
Thanks.
Welcome to our Talking Volumes chat. Thanks for watching the interview with Chang-rae Lee. And I should mention at the top here that he is not with us for the questions that we're going to be answering now. He recorded that interview, I think, last week. And we should also say that was before the recent events in Atlanta. So he obviously couldn't have addressed those questions, although he did address the issue of Asian American violence. But we are here with Minneapolis poet, teacher, writer, healer, and I was just admitting to her, very intriguingly for me, bibliotherapist, Sun Young Shin. Her book of poetry, Unbearable Splendor, won the Minnesota Book Award in, I think, 2017. And she also collected the essays, A Good Time for the Truth, Race in Minnesota, and has an upcoming book with a very intriguing concept, What We Hunger For, Refugee and Immigrant Writing on Food and Family, coming up. So we're excited to have the opportunity to chat with her about the book and My Year Abroad, and also about what other topics people have to discuss. Please remember to ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll address them as they come up. And with that, I'll say hello, Sun Young. How are you?
Hi, Chris. I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much, by the way, I should say, for joining us in a time of such trauma for all Asian American people. I really appreciate you taking the time to step away and chat about books.
Welcome. Yeah.
Did you have any did anything particular strike you in the interview that we just saw?
A lot of things. This was really interesting, because I've been following Chang-rae Lee's career for, 20 years, as then one of the few Korean American novelists in the United States. And he even had a Korean adoptee in one of his novels. And so that was interesting to me. I think my headphones are not sure if they're working. I was thinking about how this book was really good medicine for me in a way, because there's so many different Asian characters, so many different Asian in American in Asian American characters and Asian in America characters and Asians in Asia. I mean, Asia as a notion is a construction and doesn't really exist in any kind of real way. It's a land mass with many different countries and regions and peoples and ethnicities. But what it reminded me of is in my life of being, having a pan-Asian American experience, which also speaks to the anti-Asian violence that we're experiencing in this country since the previous administration's inauguration. I mean, just hate crimes in general based on race went up 400%. So reading this book at this time, since the murders in Atlanta and then another mass shooting in Boulder, a place I also have an association with, just thinking about, I'm always thinking about the nature of America. What does it mean to be, for me, a naturalized citizen of this place? What does it mean as the United States changes? What does it mean to be minoritized? What does it mean to be, diasporic? So the way that the novel, there are so many different subtle differences. So many different subtle differences and nuances between the characters that in a novel by a white novelist, mostly you would see a lot of white characters, and then the characters who weren't white would be racialized, as opposed to every character in this novel, their ethnicity emerges in one way or another.
Yeah, the white gaze is completely removed.
Right.
Do you think one thing that they touched on in the interview and that is a major factor in the book is this idea that Tiller keeps repeating, the main character keeps repeating that he's 1/12 Asian. And I can't even remember if he ever specifies where his heritage is. But anyway, he says 1/12. And I wonder if that's a response to that, sort of an effort to escape being minoritized. Because as the author just said, he can kind of pass.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it says on page 20, it's one paragraph, a word on my near whiteness. If I were fractionally Black, it would be entirely different. But being 12.5% Asian is no big deal except when somebody wants it to be. Later, it's Pong who tells another Asian character, he's Korean from his mother's side. And I think that we don't get that characterization from Tiller himself. I think it comes out then, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Did you, at one point in the book, Tiller compares himself to Pip from Great Expectations. And there is a kind of a Dickens, one of the things that wasn't discussed in that interview is the book is really funny. And there is a little bit of a Dickens-y quality to it. I think we would say it's probably a picaresque. Does that ring true for you?
I would say that. I mean, I like thinking about it as a picaresque, as a Bildungsroman, as a coming of age. It reminded me, in terms of American literature, of both Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison and a little bit of The Great Gatsby. And with a kind of more passive narrator, or a younger narrator, in Invisible Man, our invisible unnamed protagonist is thrown into this quest, which will take him, into Harlem, and he's being buffeted this way and that by different forces, and has to respond and has to, kind of grow up into that very racialized, very conflictual environment. So yeah, I think Pip is another good, that he's kind of this father figure, this entrepreneur, this person just kind of plucks him out of obscurity, or double obscurity, as he's, living kind of this fugitive life with his girlfriend, Val. Yeah.
Was there ever a time in your life when you felt Tillerish?
I didn't even think about that, because I think the book has, like, the characters have such distinctive gender identities. Their gender is such a, and Tiller's, his sexuality is such a part of his relationality with the women in the novel. But I think because I can't pass as anything other than, East Asian, I didn't have the option the way that Tiller has of coming into his identity in that way, that I actually think is really beautiful, is really beautifully traced throughout the novel, in the way that I felt like there was a parallel with his nascent palate, his taste palate emerged at the hot dog, with the yogurt and with the hot dogs, and he has several of these experiences throughout the novel, like in karaoke, and where he's, like Chang-rae Lee was saying, like he's having to kind of shed the hiding behind mediocrity, hiding behind like passivity. Yeah, so in that way, no, but I'm also an adoptee, so I my life has been racialized in that way, in that Tiller was being raised by a white father and by a mostly white mother who then abandons him. So I mean, the abandonment part as an adoptee, I could relate to, in that mystery. Yeah.
One thing that he just said that I thought was really interesting, and that I always am fascinated by in movies and books and whatever, is this concept that he's showing us a portion of this lives, but he also would like us to be aware we're just seeing a little bit. There's tons of life going on outside the margins of the book. And I think he does a really good job of having that come across in the book, because it's bursting with life and characters and experiences, and you always are sort of wondering, well, what if he'd gone in that door over there instead of the door that he did go in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a like choose your own adventure.
Oh,
kind of
that's a perfect description.
kind of world. Is super rich, and I was really just experiencing a lot of pleasure and joy in Chang-rae Lee's just control over description. Place experiences, physical experiences are described in such vivid detail with such interesting metaphors and similes, and the particularities of life, of like living the life. It has, I think what he was saying a little bit in his interview is that, it's like an exercise in existentialism, the novel of what do you do with this life? Now that, especially, so he's 20, he's kind of at the edge of turning 21, and, he can't just float along really as much anymore, or Pong comes and plucks him out of his kind of floating stasis or stagnating, the town of Stagno. And in that way, like, all of us have an inner Tiller, or all of us have an inner 20-year-old, if we're actually not 20, that can experience rebirth and resurrection and adventure if we're open to it, and if we have the privilege to explore that.
I'm really glad you mentioned the tastes in the book too, which are such a strong and beautifully described theme. And maybe, I suppose it's something that's on your mind because of your new book that you're working on in particular. But also, I mean, a 20-year-old's job is to taste a lot of stuff and find out if he likes it and make mistakes and do all of the things, which
Right.
Tiller makes plenty of and tastes lots of things.
Yes. And I think the kind of parallel growing up of Vij, I mean, I hope everyone reads this book just for the character of Vijay, because he is utterly fantastic.
Oh,
I just found him so incredibly delightful. And I think, seems like Chang-rae Lee had a lot of fun writing him. And
would you be up for describing him for a minute? Folks may not be familiar with him.
Yeah. And, he's described by Tiller as like semi-sociopathic, but in an affectionate way. He's not a violent character or violent child. He's extremely intense. He's spoiled. He is all about kind of his appetites. He is, just different than other children, kind of maybe a small adult, or like a little Napoleon or kind of character. And as he discovers he's an amazing chef, I mean, that's this other parallel. Tiller gets to father him and experience an attentive, if troubled mother through that sort of makeshift family he joins. Yeah, it's I found it very tender and moving.
Me too. In a way, he's one of the series of mostly male, but I guess not exclusively male mentors that Tiller has, who show him, okay, you could be going for more than you're going for. You have more in you than you think you do.
Right.
Which, who doesn't need that?
Right.
Do you, when you write, one question that I thought was just asked that was really interesting was, I think the way he phrased it was, are you a 9-to-5 writer? And as he was writing that, I was thinking of the fact that I was about to talk with you, and I realized, I mean, I write, and I am basically almost by definition a 9-to-5 writer, but poetry seems to be such a completely different language, such a completely different realm to me, that I can't quite imagine somebody saying, okay, well, it's 10 o'clock, time to sit down at the office and write poetry. It seems like it has to be a factor of inspiration, but am I nuts?
I mean, for me, it is. I know that, novelists are amazing separate creatures. The kind of more workman-like. Some poets are like that too, and that's amazing.
Are they?
That doesn't work for me. It hasn't worked for me so far, but yeah, I usually, deadlines are very inspiring. Or occasions, writing an occasion. I felt just, in the past few days, like not once all the names of the victims came out, I thought I want to write a poem for each person.
Oh my gosh.
And, otherwise, I'm a sporadic writer, but I envy and salute the writers who write every day. And I think that's marvelous if you can arrange your life to do that, and if that's what you want to do.
Yeah. Well, it certainly seems to have worked out.
Our audience, are there any questions about the novel or about Asian American literature or anything that folks want to talk about? I'm happy to try to. I'm just like the backup dancer here because the Chang-rae Lee is not with us, but
maybe one good question would be, in the absence of listener questions, is, are there a couple of other writers that you'd like to recommend to people?
Oh my gosh, yes, there's so many. There's just such a flowering of like a furious fountaining of Asian American literature, poetry, as well as creative nonfiction and nonfiction. In terms of understanding what's going on with anti-Asian hate crimes, I strongly recommend Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, who's also a Korean American writer and poet first. So that's her book of essays. And, it's a New York Times bestseller. It's not an obscure book by any means, but her work, Alexander Chi, who is a novelist and a memoirist. Those are just two who are, doing a lot of good literary citizenship in terms of, holding space and opening up space for these conversations as woven through kind of a literary lens, as well as, just being an everyday person lens. So those are two that I recommend. And then, many, many others that I would always love to talk about as well.
Well, and we should remind people too that your book, A Good Time for the Truth, probably has resources that would be helpful for people, especially at this moment.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've got several Asian American writers in the book that I've been lucky enough to, who were lucky enough, I was lucky enough to get those writers' trust, that they trusted me to take their work, so Bao Phi, Kaukalia Yang, David Mura, Jaeron Kim, and I just did an event from 4 to 6 with the Minnesota Department of Education and with librarians, which was amazing. But yeah, those are Sherry Kwan Lee. Those are our Asian American writers and we're all of, different ethnicities and have different immigration histories. So you do get quite a breadth in terms of just a handful of writers. Yeah.
Yeah, as you go through that list, it strikes me that we are really lucky in Minnesota to have so many. Amy has chimed in with a question. She wants to know more about your new book.
Oh, thank you. Yes, so it's coming out from Minnesota Historical Society Press in May. It's available for pre-order now, and it's 14 essayists who are all either refugees or immigrants or from refugee and immigrant families writing about food, because I wanted to, I'm not a chef, I'm not a professional food writer, by trade, but there's so many conversations around cultural appropriation of food, and I wanted to have a multi-ethnic conversation. And that book is not even mostly really about cultural appropriation, but it is, for me, a response to, we have our own stories to tell. And food means a lot of different things to each of us and in each of our communities. And, we want to learn, I always want to learn more from other folks in communities I'm living where I've put down roots. So it's personal essays. There are some recipes, and it's the stories just run the gamut in terms of tender, tragic. There's of course family separation. There's a lot of love. There's a lot of love for the food, love for ancestral cuisine, but also love for, foodways and practices that are particular to a family or a person. There's memories, as well as, what's going on right now with that writer and food. And I'm just really excited about it because I think that it's, there are more conversations now about food sovereignty, about food apartheid, about our industrial food systems, about climate change, also about, being a person of color and mental health and physical health. And I wanted to have a space for all of these. So I'm really proud of this project, and I'm really, grateful for the folks in it. And you're gonna love it. It's fantastic.
Well, and it has to have been in the works for a long time before that, but the timing could not be better with all the discussion about what's going on at Bon Appetit. And and we should remind people the name of that is What We Hunger For: Refugee and Immigrant Writing on Food and Family, correct?
Refugee and Immigrant Stories on Food and Family. Of course, it has to be a long title. Yeah.
With a colon.
Yes, and so, you know, we'll be doing as many events as we can in the coming months and years, and we hope that it's a book. I hope that it's a book that stirs up a lot of conversation, where we learn about each other, where we can come together across, you know, different groups, and celebrate, you know, doing better with each other in all kinds of ways, and, you know, honoring where we're coming from. And I think it will be, I hope it will be a peace building project.
It sounds like it will. And a couple people want to know if you think you'll publish the poems you're writing about the Atlantic.
Oh, yeah. I imagine I will publish them. I'm not sure. I just started thinking about writing them. I guess, you know, I can ask around to see who might be interested in publishing them. If no one's particular, you know, I can just put them on Medium or something. Although I would think I would think I could probably find, you know, some kind of platform. And as far as what I'll write, I don't know, but you know, these are, I would want them to be poems of, they would be elegies for me. But I would just I would tread carefully, since I didn't know these people personally. So there's just caution that needs to be taken. So I'm just going to do some thinking about it, but
yeah, it's also really raw right now. So
yeah.
Here's a long question, so I'm going to read it all to you. It's from Y. Wang Lai, and it's: for Asian American writers, poets, and other creatives, do you think your work would be viewed the same way by the native Asians, i.e. people who actually grow up and live in their own countries, versus the immigrant experience many of us have as our background? In other words, do you think the lived experience of the different kinds of Asians color or influence how they react to and digest the same work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I wonder, I imagine that Chang-rae Lee's work has been translated into Korean, but I've actually never thought about it until now. I read a lot of Korean novels and some poetry that, you know, that have been translated into English. I do have an answer to that question because I was invited to participate in a Korean diasporic writer conference in 2018 in Seoul, which was sponsored by the Korean Literature Translation Institute. And it was really based around this question, like Korean writers around the world, most of whom write in the languages of their, you know, country that they emigrated to. What does it mean to be a Korean writer? Korean culture is very kind of possessive of its diaspora and of this notion of, you know, a strong, unbroken ethnic identity. So one of the most interesting questions that I had when I was there, and I was on one of the panels, is a Korean writer woman asked me, she said for her as a Korean, it was really hard for her to feel like an individual, how that she would stand out from the masses. You know, it's a much more collective society than the United States, and has, you know, a long thousands of years of literary tradition of its own. And so that really struck me, because for me as a minority, more minoritized writer, or any writer of color in the United States, it's often that we, you don't want to be seen as an individual and not, so it's kind of the opposite problem of like, how do you stand out as an individual in Korea as a Korean writer? And then in the United States, it's like, how do you deal with all the stereotypes about your people and your community, and about how you've been represented in literature and in film and TV and so forth for, you know, the centuries of American media and literature. So I think these questions are really salient, and I think in this time of, you know, global literature and race and immigration issues, xenophobia here, you know, I think they're really relevant. Yeah, so thank you.
Well, thank you for that. We've run out of time, but I really appreciate your thoughtful comments. And again, thanks for joining us in a traumatic time for everyone. And we hope folks will tune into more Talking Volumes and read Mr. Lee's book. And again, look for your book, What We Hunger For, Refugee and Immigrant Writing on Food and Family. Thanks again.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.